Good afternoon. Let's convene the Board Governance Committee, and let's begin with a roll call.
Yes, thank you, Chair Yee.
Here.
Mr. Zeiger for the State Superintendent. Is Miss Ortega here? Okay. And Mr. Boykin for State Treasurer. Okay. Mr. Unterman? Here. Mr. Rosenstiel? Chair Yee, you have a quorum. You may proceed.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, members. First item is just approval of the committee agenda. Okay. Moved by Ms. Ortega. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Rosenstiel. Without objection, the agenda is approved. Next item is the approval of the minutes from the April 1st, 2015 committee meeting. Had a chance to review those? Okay. Is there a motion? Concern? Ms. Ortega? Moved. Second by Mr. Boykin. Without objection, the April 1st committee minutes are approved. Members, we have a number of informational items, and we'll start with item number 3, the review of the proposed organizational reports. This is coming back to us for second reading after significant input by the committee members last time. Let me turn this over to Mr. Bardo and Ms. McDuffie and Ms. Hewitt.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Amy McDuffie with the Fiduciary Services Practice of Aon Hewitt Investment Consulting. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to see all of you today. This is the second reading of the routine reports draft policy. And back in April, we brought this draft to the committee to get your early views and your desired direction on how to best move this forward. The policy objectives that we were trying to accomplish were threefold, and I thought I would recap those quickly to set the context. The first was really to define the board's due diligence universe in terms of the regular repeating activities across the organization that the board is responsible for monitoring. The second was to provide the board with a mechanism by which you can monitor that compliance over time. And then the third, of course, is to support succession planning, both for the board and for executive staff by documenting current practice, again, across the organization in terms of the routine reports that you receive. Now, interestingly, these routine reports, the regular items that you receive either annually or monthly or quarterly, sometimes every 3 years, every 4 years, this really represents just a portion of the reports that you're receiving. You also are receiving project-based reports as well as reports with respect to individual questions that arise during the context of your committee and board meetings. So I wanted to make sure that we have the appropriate focus, that this is just the regular recurring items. The other issue that was discussed back in April was really forward-looking to say, now that we have this listing of the regular reports, how do we, as a committee, improve the overall efficiency and effectiveness and the volume and complexity of the information that the board receives over time? That was a separate, broader issue that would encompass not just the regular reporting items, but also the project-based reports and other items as well. So at the pleasure of the committee, I'd like to first focus on the policy draft itself, the routine reports, and to get additional feedback today now that we have looked at the additional information requests that the committee had asked for last time.
Yes.
Madam Chair? Okay. So this draft, which is starts on Board Governance 9, the actual written narrative of the policy itself is on Board Governance 8, but the focus of the prior conversation was on the listing in the appendix that begins on Board Governance 9. And there's a number of revisions that are reflected in this draft. I'd like to walk the committee through those at a very high level. The first represents some minor cleanup items that we had talked about with you, the committee, and I can go into detail on those if you'd like. They were with respect to title changes. We had some reporting frequency items that we wanted to make sure were synchronized with each other. The second major revision that's reflected in here is that there's an additional column. We added a reporting venue. And so you can see that on for example, on Board Governance 9, there's a reported to column. That's the third from the right-hand side. So that is new across each of the information items that you're seeing here. We also identified the open and closed session nature of the items and whether the item itself is provided for information, for action, as part of the consent agenda. You can see that's a brand-new column that is the second from the right-hand side called session type. There is another column here. We wanted to respond to the request to ensure that the reports that were contained within, that nothing was missing, and nothing major was missing or left out. And so we had a lot of help from Mr. Bartow's legal team, including Ms. Lukens and others, to go through actually looking at the statutory provisions that are applicable, finding the legal requirements for reporting, as well as going through the entire board policy manual to ensure that we had captured everything. And so that results where you see the reference column on the very right-hand side. Lastly, we added hyperlinks to the reports. There was a sentiment in April that having quick and easy access to the items that have been previously provided to you within this context would be important. So where possible, where we could, we linked out to the calstrs.com website so you could easily see and access where those items were. So at a high level, those are the revisions that are reflected here. Again, it was a tremendous research effort to bring all of this additional information. And so I did want to thank, again, Mr. Bartow's legal team, as well as the executive staff members for making themselves available as we double-checked this information. And Madam Chair, I'd like to ask for feedback or any suggested edits that the committee has with respect to this current draft.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. McDuffie. I appreciate the added information. This is very comprehensive and gives us an idea of, I think, a pretty good overview of the routine reports that are before us. Let me just see if there's any feedback for you. Start with Ms. Dillon.
Amy, I agree. You've done a yeoman's job in putting all this information together, and so is staff in helping you do this for us. You had just said something about a link, and ironically, I had just clicked on one of the links. Can you tell me again what the links are intended to do? Because I think what actually happened wasn't what you had actually said.
Sure. Let me walk through that, what we tried to do.
Yeah.
Hyperlinks as a backdrop, as you know, are sort of a strange beast because they update pretty frequently. And so what we tried to do where possible is either link you directly to the report or to the page on calstrs.com where it's listed. Is that different than what
Actually
you
happened?
experienced?
Well, I don't know if this is where it was supposed to go or not, but under governance, the very first page we have, board member continuing education, it actually took us to a page that had been in a previous meeting.
Oh, okay.
I think I know why, probably. No, we're getting a little bit, but if it's within the board book, I don't think it's hyperlinked to a specific page because the board policy book is one continuous PDF file. So probably in that example, I noticed that myself. In some of those examples, it's linking to board items.
To an actual board item.
I
not
caught
to
that
something-
too.
Yeah, okay.
We've got to improve on getting the board book more hyperlinked so that we can get you to a page on it, not to the whole
A specific
150
item.
pages. Yeah. I don't want to bore you with the technology aspect
No,
of
no,
it.
no,
I think that's the issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
It also may be due to the sensitivity of how the report or information is treated. I think that particular item was a closed session informational item.
Yeah, we didn't link to close because you'd be
Yes.
you on the other side of the firewall. If there was a close, that would be another problem too.
Yes,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where you don't see the blue font in the title of the report, there is no hyperlink at this point in time.
Although, just for clarification, I don't remember ever seeing a board member continuing education item in closed session.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's not a closed session,
Yeah.
it's whatever we had on our
Yeah.
agenda in February.
Right, that was the only thing there that we
And
could,
then
yeah.
the business plan takes us to the website where the business plans are. It was just Because I happened to open it as you were saying that, and I said, that's not what that is. So,
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, this is one of the comments and suggestions that I wanted to make to the committee today was more around a question in terms of the level of detail that you want to ultimately be part of this policy. Because I really do think that, for example, the hyperlinks themselves could become problematic rather quickly because as they update, that then invokes an update to the policy that needs to be made. I do also want to be sensitive to the fact that at the April meeting, there was some sentiment that it'd be really nice to have specific direct links for the board to have access to those. And the suggestion there is that we could take a mirror image of this listing and make it available behind the board website and include all the hyperlinks and make sure that they're entirely accurate and they're pointing to the exact right document where we're having issues, and then remove the hyperlinks from the policy. It's only a suggestion for consideration, but it might be better to, I guess, give this policy itself a longer shelf life.
Other feedback? Ms. Ortega?
Well, I don't really think the, excuse me, the hyperlinks are particularly necessary. It feels to me that having the list and knowing when we might see them and everything that's presented is the useful piece of it. And if it's something that would have been a public document, I'm pretty sure you could easily Google the title and it'll come up. You're gonna find it pretty easily. And otherwise, if it's an issue that you say, well, I remember we talked about this, but I can't remember what the title is, or I don't remember when it is, you're probably gonna email a staff person anyway and say,
Sure.
can you send me this report or remind me what we talked about? So I think making it as simple a resource as possible is the best approach. So that's my.
Thank you, Ms. Ortega. Mr. Bardo, could you?
I just, it's not clear from the recommendation or proposal, so I wanted to add my own twist to it. I'd like to see the policy portion, in other words, the verbiage about the policy in the policy manual, but I'd like the listing to be an exhibit or an appendix to the policy manual to allow for updating between revisions or without having to revise the entire policy manual. And the reason I suggest this is if there is something that's presented in front of a committee or in front of the board that has to be added to it, that should be part of the discussion. Is this a report we're going to add to our appendix, rather than having to come back to the board or the governance committee every time there's a change or an addition onto this. And then we could review it, let's say annually. We could say, is this up to date, or are there revisions? But I would hate for you to have to revise address the entire policy if there's a minor change made in the list of reports. So that would be my suggestion as far as how to slice it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bardo. I think that's a good suggestion, certainly given the various references that are behind most of these reports. It would seem to suggest that we want to keep the policy fairly clear, and that is the standing policy, and that much of this will be potentially fluid. So we should treat it differently in terms of the listing of the report. Thank you. Mr. Rosenstein.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually find the hyperlinks very, very useful, and in fact, I'd kind of like. I mean, I think this serves two purposes. One purpose is it says what needs to be provided, and so in that sense, it's not a resource necessarily for the board as much as it's just a determination that this is what has to be provided by staff to the board or to the public. But but it seems to me that once we have that, it's nice to have the convenience of being able to use it as a way to get to those documents, as well as to know when they were. I mean, in other words, it would be nice, I think, to know when when, what the date was of these, of these latest ones, so that we have a sense of that. But again, that's just for the, I think for me, the convenience of a board member wanting to access some of these things.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. Other comments, members? Mr. Zeiger?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's handy to have the links. For me, the answer is, oh, that report. Now, what does that look like again? And the hyperlink lets you jump real quickly to remind you of, oh yeah, it was that report near his house. Because as you notice, we do have a lot of reports. And remembering which one is in what sort of format is difficult. So to be able to easily jump and say, oh yeah, not necessarily even if I want to review the whole content, but this is what they look like and this is what we're getting in there. So hyperlinks are handy. There's no reason not to have lots of them.
Thank you. Mr. Unterman?
Yes, thanks for accumulating this. I had the sneaking suspicion that there were an awful lot of reports, and now we know that there indeed are. It strikes me two things. One, it'd be helpful as this list is kind of reworked to separate out things there are a number of things here that are reports that are just to the staff, that the staff generates and reviews and in the ordinary course doesn't bring to us. I think if you had those categorized separately, I think that'd be helpful. By the way, we'll also vote for hyperlinks. And similarly, separate out those reports that are made and list them separately as things that are made for public information that don't necessarily lead to board action, like the state lands report. I mean, there's a bunch of them in there that just make the list a little bit harder to work with. But then it also strikes me that you'll be left with a residual of reports that do relate to board action, and there are a lot of them close to the same subject. And the question is whether we should find a way to ask the staff to kind of consolidate them so that we're talking about fewer documents that are more focused to the issues that are most important to us in any given time. Because it sort of seems like once you establish a report, like the semi-annual report of the real estate consultant, you're going to get that forever, even though it's maybe not the most important thing in the world if the program is moving in accordance with its guidelines and its expectations and things like that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Underwood. So it looks like what we have is a couple of suggestions back to Ms. McDuffie. And first of all, let me just thank Mr. Bardo, Ms. Lukens for the terrific support in getting this compiled and all the additional research. But it seems to me, and I actually somewhat agree with Ms. Ortega with respect to hyperlinks, although I would hate to have all this great research done in terms of now having this compilation and not actually having some of these things available. And so if there's a way to, maybe Ms. McDuffie, according to your recommendation, to be able to put a mirror of this behind our website such that the policy is separated from the reports. And there's an easy way just to maintain the list of reports to be sure they're updated. And the policy will stand on its own with respect to, and pursuant to what Mr. Bardo suggested, that will be the standing policy for the reports.
Madam Chair, if I could clarify, just so I make sure that I'm clear. My suggestion to put a mirror image, if you will, of the appendix itself so that it's accessible to the board would not be mutually exclusive from having this listing be an appendix in the policy itself. Right. Okay, I just wanted to clarify because that, it's important that it is part of that. Right. It does seem to me that as part of the policy, the hyperlinks do not need to be included, right. And that's the sentiment of the committee at this time. Okay, great, just confirming.
Good. And then to Mr. Unterman's point, kind of then the next level of how we can, I guess, manage the volume a little bit better to look at, I guess, the specific audience for the report. And to really give some special focus to those reports that are to the board, and certainly those that really are for the broader public. And then using the opportunity then to assess what's left with respect to any opportunities for streamlining or consolidating the information in those other reports.
Yes. And it seems that in terms of the last concept, when you have residual reports that are left, Mr. Unterman, that are close to the same subject, when we look at that, we'll want to pay careful attention to ensure that, you may have a circumstance where certain reports can be collapsed, but from a transparency and a compliance monitoring standpoint, you may still want to have those separate titles or somehow have a description so that the right information is coming. And let me give an example of that. For example, Board Governance 9, when you're looking at items 2, 3, and 4 around the CEO, CIO performance evaluation, the independent verification of the performance calculations always comes as part of that package. In addition, board member attendance, board member continuing education, those are items that are provided as part of the offsite package. Right now, they are sort of collapsed. They're provided together. We call them out separately because of the need that we felt for you as fiduciaries to have all those items called out.
Okay.
So perhaps there's a way to, if we're prioritizing those reports that really have a broader audience, kind of the general public, and then those that are focused on reports, and then those reports to the board, perhaps then there's some way of grouping some of those other ones so that they're related and they can somehow be together. But the priority is really kind of transparency for the general public, and then those that are just really particular to the board.
As well as continuing the same information flow to you, the board, on certain topics. And perhaps we can address that issue with a description, a better or a more enhanced description. So we'll certainly take a look at that with Mr. Unterman with your request in mind.
Could I just?
Yes, of course, Mr. Unterman.
Yeah, so my last point was, I think it would be helpful, having identified a universe of reports that we could receive all the time. And I know on one level, the more reports you get, the better you can argue that you've done your fiduciary duty. On the other hand, if you get so many reports that you can't really absorb them, you wonder whether that's true. I wonder whether we can establish some sort of process where we'd say, okay, some of these informational type reports that we get, we don't really need to have presented in a meeting at this point.
Yes.
And we have a screening process in place that says, okay, this quarter, we don't need to hear from our global equities because we're tracking the index. And we don't hear anything more but that. Or we're within our tracking error. And I think that would take some work on the part of you proactively talking about the agenda and our reporting cycle with the chair and co-chair. But I think we could make our meetings more meaningful, where we'll have more time for those things that are important or particularly timely.
And we would do that consulting with your fiduciary counsel.
Yeah.
To make sure that, if there is any sort of change, especially in those reports that are dictated by your policy, your investment policy. So we want to make sure we get the right flavor. As Mr. Unterman pointed out, that, receiving a report as a board member rather than having it presented in the context of a board meeting or a committee meeting. And so we certainly, if we do that, we would want to do that in consultation with your fiduciary counsel.
Yes.
Maybe some things occasionally would move to a consent agenda and just be that.
Thank you for the clarification, and you're spot on, Mr. Unterman, and that, in terms of commentary and approach for how we would do that, not only for the routine reports, but the project-based reports as well going forward. sort of a separate discussion from the policy draft in front of you, but certainly planned in terms of addressing that today if you'd like more information.
Very well, thank you. Other comments? Okay, thank you. Ms. McDuffie, do you have sufficient direction? Moving forward.
Yes, I do. Thank you,
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Bardo, any other concerns here?
Yeah, this is an informational item, and it's scheduled as the first item on your work plan
Yes, it is.
for next fiscal year. So we'll bring it back with some of those groupings and additional information.
Okay, great. Thank you for the continued work on this. Thank you, members, for the comments. So we will revisit this item when we proceed next, incorporating it into our work plan. So we move on to item number 4, the 2015-16 work plan. Mr. Barber?
Thank you. Well, this is really an open discussion for the chair and the committee members to decide what the focus should be, what you want to spend your time and effort on, what you want staff to concentrate on. There are some suggestions. We consulted with the chair on this and the staff. And so there are some items that are out here as suggested inclusion for your discussion, your editing, your additions. And so actually I would open it up to the chair and the committee for their suggestions as to the work plan.
Thank you, Mr. Bardo. So with respect to the work plan, what I had hoped to get done, and we've covered one of the major items, and that is the organization of reports to the board. I had wanted to have a discussion, entertain a discussion with respect to other thoughts with regard to board operations, and particularly as it relates to our board relationship with the staff and whether there are any issues there for the committee to consider. Also with respect to the board accountability and compliance, I'm really looking at having some way of reviewing our board policies and to see whether perhaps even, Mr. Bardo and I were just in a discussion earlier, whether it might be appropriate to even have our audit and risk management consultant help us with respect to just reviewing our overall board policies to give us a sense of whether any revisions may be appropriate for us to look at, or whether there are policies that need to be revised for any purpose. But please.
Yeah, so part of the discussion that we had, and we had some of it in the ARM committee this morning, is that STRS itself is in the process of bringing on a compliance consultant to take a look at our overall compliance program. And I was suggesting that perhaps we would just expand that scope of work and ask the consultant to take a look at your board policy and take a look at what our current compliance activities are, and to recommend any additional compliance activities specifically for the board to monitor its compliance with its own policy manual. So I thought if it pleased the committee that we could that we could incorporate that particular item into the scope of work of the consultant, at least to get some initial review and recommendations to bring back to this committee for further discussion.
Okay. Let me hear from some of the members. Mr. Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to suggest the committee consider using this forum next year for educational opportunities on governance itself. And what I'm thinking is more along the lines of potentially a panel format, or a similar to the format we're going to have with Mr. Steyer in our CIO on Friday, which I think is a nice change of just a conversation between two people, But specifically, for example, for me, I'll just speak for myself, I can get in a little bit of a silo, and we're at CalSTRS, we're in Sacramento, we're talking with other trustees, but I think there's an opportunity for us to learn from other trustees, not only in California, but Canadian trustees, European trustees. What are the similarities? What are the differences? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? How are they doing business? How are they functioning? And I'm not thinking, this has to be something extravagant, but just bringing forth some people who sit in similar chairs that we do, and how they're functioning. What does it mean to be a fiduciary in 2015 versus 2000 or 1995? For some of us, that might be a great opportunity. For others, it may not add as much value. But I think collectively, I think we could grow and really be efficient with our time. I think with Ms. McDuffie and some of the other experts that we have access to, I think we could really think about some high caliber folks who are considered, leaders on governance from different seats within the institutional investment world. And when I was thinking about this, I wasn't sure actually where that would go, and being sensitive to everyone's time, this would be an opportunity for the governance committee and anyone else that would like to join and sit in on it, on those types of educational opportunities. So that I offer that up as a suggestion, Madam Chair.
Good, thank you. Good suggestion. Mrs. Rosensteel.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to get back to, Brian, what you were describing. So the responsibility of to assess whether we're in compliance with all sorts of things, both internal policies as well as legal and regulatory compliance. Where does that responsibility sit? It's not clear to me that we know where within we know within the organization it sits with you. We don't know where within the board it sits. Is that a governance responsibility to oversee compliance with legal, regulatory, and internal policies? Or do we not know?
It's an excellent question, and the answer is we don't know. We would look for recommendations, but I also wanted to maybe pare that down. What I was talking about was specifically just having someone take a look at our policy manual and ways in which perhaps the board governance committee could at least look at some ways to ensure compliance within the policy manual. But without having any specific suggestions or analysis, I really think it's premature for, certainly for me to say this is something that the board governance committee should look at. I just thought if we could leverage looking at internal compliance, that we perhaps could leverage the opportunity to look at board policy manual compliance and some suggestions on how that could be done, and whether or not it ends up in this committee is certainly, that this discussion is I think a little bit premature, and what that would look like is also premature. My suggestion to the chair was just that we try to leverage the opportunity to take a look at this and see if there are any recommendations that would come out of it, and it would be up to the board to decide where such activities would lie.
Well, I certainly support any effort to sort of make it easier for the board to be in compliance, so that we don't make inadvertent mistakes of being out of compliance. And with a very large board policy manual, I think, there's a lot to be compliant with. So I certainly support that. If what we're looking at is, are there ways to accomplish that, so that we do have greater compliance, I think that's a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Rosensteel. Mr. Unterman?
You know, one thing that strikes me as we get on the subject of compliance, and frankly, it goes back to the list of reports that we got, which was the genesis of it at one point was, gee, we have to think of a way to make our board meetings more efficient, our board work more efficient, and our board prep more efficient. One thing that does strike me is there's a very dramatic range of materiality established on the different subjects we address. In the investment side, if it's not 0.5% of assets or greater, the board has delegated authority entirely. And it's actually a pretty staggering amount of money, or a pretty staggering threshold. So I think as we look at these compliance items and some of our board policies as to things we require the board to zero in on, I think we should develop some sense of scale as to how much impact they have organizationally or economically or to our members. Because some of these things, if you look at the scale between $1 billion and some of these things which are very minute, it just seems disproportionate.
Thank you. That's a great point. Okay. Other comments, members? Okay. Mr. Keeley, your suggestion for an educational component of the governance committee's work, I wholeheartedly support. I think we can really continue to proceed doing our work in a pretty insular fashion without any kind of recognition of what else may be developing with whether it's peers or other that are similarly situated and serving in our capacities. So I would look at incorporating that aspect of education into our work plan. And I apologize if I seem to jump the gun on the compliance issue, but this is really about reviewing our existing policies and similar to what we've done with the reports, but just to have some outside look with respect to our current policies and for compliance purposes. Other comments, members? Okay. Mr. Bardo, any other thoughts?
Just as I'm looking at your proposed work plan,
Yes.
it looks like April would be a good opportunity to try to put in educational
Yes.
session.
Yes.
If you don't mind, that's what we'll term it for the purposes of drafting this for the approval or discussion by the full board in July.
Okay.
I think that you have, November, you have sort of a yeoman's task of going through at least 2 items that won't reappear, hopefully won't reappear. One is this policy that you just looked at, and another is this self-assessment next steps. So it sounds like then you would have 2 items to work through the rest of the year. So I think education, if we can do our best to try to come up with something that's acceptable, a panel or an issue for you, and put that in April.
That's right.
If that's
Okay. All right. Thank you. If there are no other comments on item number 4, we'll move on to review of information requests.
There was no information items
All right.
at this time, Chair Yu.
Item number 6, draft agenda for the next committee meeting. Any comments on that? Okay. Hearing none. We do have, and for item number 7, we do have a request from the public to speak. Mr. Foglia, are you here? Yes.
Thank you very much. Ed Folia from CTA Retirees. Wanted to go back to the report on item number 3. And under written reports provided to the board, number 5, board attendance. Now, we've spoken to the board before on this subject, and I will like to find out when there's a vacancy on the board. Does this particular section report in their report that there is a vacancy on the board?
Mr. Brown?
No, not currently.
Okay? So that is really surprising that a constitutional mandate that we have a retiree on the board is not reported to the board on a regular basis that you are in violation of the Constitution of the state of California. And this constitutional crisis has been existing for 4 years. Now, I'm pleased to say that Chairperson Yee took the initiative on our last time we brought this to the attention of the Governance Committee, and we did get the 11th member of the board appointed, Nora Vargas, and we will certainly say thank you and welcome tomorrow at the general board meeting. But if we can follow up and remind the governor that this vacancy is still in violation of the Constitution of the state of California, and urge him to appoint one as soon as possible. Now, some of you are going to say, well, you better watch out what you wish for. I can guarantee you that in the past, every time a governor that was not necessarily of our persuasion selected a board member, they automatically knew what's in their best interest once they sat on the board. And in several cases, they were not reappointed by the governor. This position was not put there for political reasons. It was put there to ensure that the stakeholders of retirees should be represented. And I am tired of the political game. We have outstanding people that have applied for this position and have been passed over because of past experience. Since when has past experience been a criteria not to appoint? If past experience was something that the voters didn't approve, Governor Brown would not have been reelected. Okay? So, I want some consistency. And I might be a pain to some people, but I think what's right is right. Because we had another appeals panel today. Not one of you as board members are retirees, so you don't know what we're living on a day-to-day basis. And we can't continue to say, well, that's a political appointment. It's an appointment by the governor, and he's done an excellent job in his appointments. And I applaud every one of you that have been appointed by the governor. He's gotten diversity. He's got more gender balance. That's fantastic. But one thing he isn't doing is age discrimination. And until you appoint somebody from the retirees, you're in violation of the the Constitution of the state of California, plus you are engaging in age discrimination. And that, to me, is something that you just don't let slide by. So I think that should be in a report every single year. The same report that you make on attendance is exactly what you would do. Now, what I am also impressed is that we have 2 state constitutional officers that come here on a regular basis and take this job very, very seriously. And the minute they step down, they have someone else to take their place. If that is that important for a state constitutional officer, Why is it important for a retiree to have the same have a person representing on the board? Now, I don't want to sound disrespectful, but I am frustrated. And as a frustrated retiree who's advocated for teachers since 1957, realize that what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. And what's not happening here is wrong. And so many of you have a good relationship with the governor. I hope that Chairperson Yee, that you bring this again to his attention to help us get through this constitutional crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Folia. Thank you, and certainly understand your frustration, and I'd be more than happy to make the inquiry again in the governor's appointments office. Thank you. Okay. Other comments from members? Okay, hearing none, the Board Governance Committee is adjourned. Thank you.